Let me navigate to Visual Studio Code and let's define properties and dependencies required for this MCP demo. I'll open pom.xml. First, I will define dependency needed for MCP client. So this is the dependency Spring AI Starter MCP client. Now let's define MCP server dependency Spring AI Starter MCP server. Also, one more dependency, that is Spring AI Starter MCP Server Web MVC. If you are implementing a reactive web application, here instead of a web MVC, you have to use WebFlux dependency. So these are the three dependencies required for this demo. Now let me navigate to application.yaml file. In Spring AI, I'll define MCP. First, I'll define server properties. Server, let's give it a name. Let's also define a version. Here we are using streamable protocol instead of gRPC. Streamable. Type, it's not REST, it will be sync. In case of WebFlux, it should be async. Also, let me define annotation scanner to scan MCP related annotations. Now let me define properties for client, MCP client. Type will be sync as it is in MCP server. As I am defining server and the client in same application, I will define a request timeout here, 30 seconds. Then tool callback enabled true. Also configure streamable HTTP where I'll give server URL here. If you are running your MCP server as different application, you should give that URL here. This is the context bar where I expose MCP tools. So I'll create all the MCP server related files here in this package. First, I'll define a component here, new file, MCP weather service.java. This is a component, so I'll annotate this with component annotation. Here, I'll define a method that is getWeather, which takes two parameters, string city and string country. Now, in case of string country is not equal to null, not equal to blank, then what I will do is I'll concatenate city with country, else I'll just say city. I will assign this to a variable string location. Let me reformat it a bit. First, I'll return hard-coded response here. Now, this is a simple method. It's not doing any API call or nothing. I'm just returning a hard-coded response. How to make it as a MCP tool? I have to annotate this method with MCP tool annotation. It takes a mandatory description. Also, you can provide a name for it. Let me give it a name. I'll change this name to MCP get weather and even description get current weather for a location. Description is needed so that LLM will correctly identify which tool needs to be called. Based on this description, LLM will identify which tool it needs to invoke. Also, we will annotate this request parameter with MCP tool param annotation with description city name required equal to true. Similarly, I'll also annotate country request parameter as well. So this is how we define MCP tool. So here MCP tool marks this method as MCP callable tool. Spring AI generates, when you define this annotation, Spring AI auto generates JSON schema and registers with the MCP server. And name attribute, this is a tool identifier the LLM uses to call it. Must be unique across all MCP servers. LLM refers it by this name. And description, this is critical one. The LLM reads this and decides when to call the tool. So the bad description will lead to wrong tool calls. This annotation marks this request parameter as tool input and generates the JSON schema field for this parameter. Required equal to true marks the field as required in the schema. Now let me define the controller. I'll call it MCP controller.java. Let me add the annotation. Yes, controller request mapping MCP. Let me accept this coding suggestion. I'll delete this. This should be chat client.builder, chat client.build. We need this tool callback provider. Register these tools in the chat client. I'll use chat client.builder.default tools spec. Let me define the lambda expression here. Spec.callbacks, and we pass our tool callback provider. Then build. Now let's define the get mapping. I'll accept this coding suggestion. Chat with MCP. Request parameter we are taking a string. Let me change this implementation. It will be chat client dot prompt dot user, and we pass message, then invoke call method, then get the content. Let me build this application and run. I'll bring up my Postman. I have already added this API here, get mapping MCP/chat message, what's the weather in Udupi. Let me hit the API. It should return hard-coded response. The current weather in Udupi is sunny with temperature 22 degrees Celsius. So if you look at this MCP tool, so our MCP tool calling is working now. So our MCP client and MCP server setup is working. So if you remember, earlier we defined this weather service. It's actually a configuration, bean declaration. We used it as a tool. I'll copy this code, actual weather implementation. Let me go here, my MCP weather service. Instead of returning this hard-coded response, I'll copy paste this, change it to the location. Now we have this dynamic response. I'll send as it is. I have modified code a bit here. Instead of returning JSON as earlier, I'm just getting the weather in a string format, and I have included in try catch block, and I moved the REST client declaration to above the method. Now I'll build the application and run. I'll hit the API. What's the weather in Udupi? So the current weather is 22 degrees Celsius. Let me change this city to Delhi. I'll hit the API again, and current weather in Delhi is 42 degrees Celsius. So our REST API call inside this MCP tool is working. You can also see here the log related to the MCP get weather tool. Let me stop the application now. You can notice here, once you add MCP server, it takes few seconds to shut down the server. Don't worry, it will shut down. Now let's quickly go through what we have accomplished. First, we added these three dependencies here: MCP client, MCP server, web MVC. And we created a component class here with the name MCP weather service. We defined a method. We annotated that method with MCP tool. We added name and the description. We added these annotations to the request parameters. We called REST API to get the weather. We created a controller with get mapping /mcp/chat. User request comes here. It goes to MCP server. MCP server calls the tool. Within the tool, it calls the API, sends the response to LLM. We also define few properties here related to the MCP server and MCP client. So when we say initialized equal to false, during startup, it will not try to check this server. If you don't specify it, our application may fail during the startup. Let's wrap this tutorial here. In the next tutorial, we will look at few more APIs and examples. We'll see you there.